So we've been hearing tonight about some of the damning conclusions drawn by the Cass Review into the provision of gender identity services for under-18s by NHS England. However, we also need to acknowledge that some commentators argue that the report paints a distorted picture. So here to discuss some of these concerns, I'm delighted to be joined by the barrister Robin Moira White. Welcome to the show. Now, Robin, you are not a fan of the Cass Review. You described the research undertaken by Dr. Hilary Cass as laughably poor. Can you explain why you've come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think let's start from the fact that trans people have felt let down over years by our government and services. So if you're an adult, the waiting time currently is decades to be seen. And I think what most people feel is most trans people feel is a fundamental sadness that here was an opportunity wasted. Now, it would take longer than your show to grind through the science. So I've tried to make some quick points with a few graphics that would help. And I'm grateful to your folk for getting those ready. If we could put the first slide up, the first picture up. Now, this is the Women's Rights Conference in Saudi Arabia. Is there a missing element? Women. And that's the first position with the Cass Review, that at a very early stage it was determined that people who are, you were talking about different approaches in terms of affirmation, that no one who supports affirmation could be part of the core study, and there is no trans person who was part of the core group. Would that imagine a report on women's rights with no women in the group, or gay rights with not a gay people, and deliberately exclude it? So,
in terms of, I assume what you were talking about there is the studies that were deemed to be too low quality to include in the final review. Is that
no. I'm looking at that's a point about the review overall.
Yes.
So I'll come on to some specific criticisms.
But Dr. Cass did speak to a number of people who've been through this treatment, and
she did.
Took a very compassionate approach in doing so.
Indeed, but I'm looking at the outcomes of the report. And let's move on to the presentation. If we could put the first graph up that I supplied. Now, this is actually a page from the report, and you can see that what you have is an exponential rise, apparently, in the number of people being referred to GIDS at Tavistock. The trouble with it is that graph cuts off at 2014, and if we put the next graph up, right, here are the true figures, and the figures for the next few years, and what you actually see is that the graph we've seen is a slice of the data, and the data have plateaued. So the number of referrals, instead of that scary exponential rise, and the report doesn't make this point, and indeed we have data later than the graph that I'm showing here, which shows that actually the number of people reported have plateaued, and the report doesn't say that.
So to be clear, your view is that the exponential rise, which I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with, that has taken place, but you feel that it's not so much of a worry because it has since plateaued, and that should have been mentioned by the Cass Review.
And isn't. And if what we were looking at is, I mean, one of the ways in which young people have been let down is the immensely long waiting time, so that they were through puberty before they were going to get help. And a scary graph like that is saying, well, look, we can't cope with this, whereas actually we know what the numbers are.
I do understand what you're saying about the strength of feeling and the way in which that some people will feel let down because the conclusions reached, the findings reached, didn't align with what they wanted them to say. But, of course, ultimately, this is, you know, a very reputable paediatrician working very rigorously for 4 years' time. I don't think it's fair. Surely it's not fair. It should be taken seriously in terms of what her findings
I'm sorry, I've not looked at the reputation. I've been looking at what the outcomes and the outputs. And there are some very weird things said in the report. The report says, for example, that providing puberty blockers does not alleviate, it hasn't been shown to alleviate gender dysphoria. Well, it's never intended to. All it does is not make matters worse. Now, it's a very weird thing to say, that something doesn't do what it was never intended to do.
I suppose my concern here is that it feels like you're taking small things that you disagree with from a 388-page report and using that as a means to kind of, they call it nut-picking, don't they, to sort of just try and discredit the whole thing. Yeah. Isn't the broad point, though, of concern to you that the Cass's broad finding about puberty blockers, that there is no evidential threshold, no basis in evidence for their efficacy, Shouldn't that be of concern? If we don't have the data about what happens in later life, shouldn't that concern you?
Well, we do have data. I mean, for example, in the last week or so, a 9,000-person study based in Perth in Australia was published that provides exactly that information. And one of the really concerning things about the report is that the recommendation is to move from a type of treatment to effectively no treatment or any talking therapy. And where is the evidence that talking therapy is efficacious?
Sorry, but the 9,000 people in the Perth study, what's the findings of that?
That there is no loss of data. So one of the criticisms that's being made is that we don't find the detransitioners because they go off and hide.
Yes.
Now the Perth study says no, we have complete follow-up because the Australian system is rather different from ours. There is a holistic approach in Australia, and they stay with the people concerned. And it's supporting the level of detransition that's been reported previously, around the 1% mark.
But my understanding is that the existing studies that we have that have some kind of follow-up only retain that follow-up if people are still identified as trans and are reporting back to the doctors.
Well, some of them do. That's absolutely true. And I am not going to say that it's not good to have better data.
Right.
But to say that the data we have supports effectively a do-nothing approach, for which there is no evidence.
But Cass isn't really saying let's not. She's not ruling anything out. What she's saying is we need to have the data before we undertake what could be very, very damaging medical procedures on children.
Understanding what Cass actually says is really difficult because there was an organisation called the Kent Trust who met with Dr. Cass shortly after that. And the last slide I'd asked for is a quote from the meeting with Dr. Cass. Do we have that, please? Yeah, and there we are. So is that message consistent with what's being said by the people who are lauding the report and saying, gosh, that's great, we're not going to do this anymore?
But isn't that precisely what she's saying, is that we need more evidence, we need more long-term studies, we need data. We needed all of those 7 adult gender clinics to provide that data rather than deliberately withholding it. I mean, 6 out of the 7, that's troubling, isn't it?
What's troubling is that they were sufficiently concerned about the approach of the report that they withheld that data. Now, I don't think we have a complete clarity as to why at the moment.
Yes.
And it's important to see that.
But Cass does acknowledge that there are some people that she has met for whom the puberty-blocking treatment has been helpful, right? So that is something that is acknowledged.
Yeah, and I'm being careful about not talking about... anecdotally, I know young trans people who have been through the process which is being looked at and are living very successful lives and very happy lives. And it's right to look at the balance between those a process helps and those a process doesn't help.
Yes.
But to just junk the evidence that we do have and say, not good enough.
I'm just concerned about the idea that evidence was junked. It was there was a selectivity regarding the quality of evidence, and that the high quality studies were retained. The highest quality of which there were 2, and then the high quality studies and the medium quality studies, and that those findings were indeed incorporated into the final review. So it's not the case that she was junking every particular view.
With respect, they're not. The medium quality studies provide a large body of evidence that says this is a helpful approach.
Yes.
And we don't have evidence for the do-nothing approach. And though that evidence does not find its way through into the report's conclusions.
But you wouldn't support low-quality studies making their way into... Because you'll end up with a misleading...
Well, we had high, medium and low, and we had quite a lot of medium-quality studies. And the double-blind study, I think Cass has now acknowledged that you can't do a double-blind study in this area.
That's right, yeah.
You just can't give people a placebo and not put them through puberty when they're expecting a block.
No, and that was never asserted or attempted. That's why the Newcastle-Ottawa scale was adopted instead.
That's right. But there is still a suggestion that there has to be a control group for it to be a high-quality study. And that means you're never going to get anything like a high-quality study.
But I think that's why the medium-quality studies were incorporated into the findings.
They're incorporated, but they don't follow through into the recommendations. Now, that process is ongoing. There are a number of trans-related organisations that are working their way through the report. And in the coming weeks, I think you're going to see the reasons why Cass has been panned internationally, as I'm sure you know. You were mentioning this a little earlier on your show. CAS has been panned internationally, is not supported internationally.
Well, I've seen that from activist bodies. I haven't seen that from...
Like the American, the relevant medical association in America, who've already said that.
Yeah,
who are not activists.
Groups such as WPATH, which I do...
No, forgive me. The group of American doctors who treat people in this circumstance in America have already said that they don't like the look of CAS.
No, and my contention is that activist bodies have infiltrated most medical institutions.
Well, I don't think that's true.
Well, but let me ask you, though, if it were the case that ultimately we did have all the data, and ultimately it did turn out that this wasn't that maybe this was right for certain individuals, but for the majority it wasn't. It was detrimental. Would you at that point say, well, let's find a different approach?
I think the point you and I would agree on is that there are definitely individuals for whom this approach is right, and there are definitely individuals for whom this approach will ultimately turn out to be wrong. And I'm sure neither you nor I would disagree about that. And finding where the balance is between that, like with any form of medical treatment, is the right thing to do. But if you get medical treatment that's really helpful for a substantial group, to say we wait forever to work out how tiny the group is that aren't helped, when we've good evidence, it may not be the best evidence in the world, but good evidence that it's really helpful for a large group, then we shouldn't be avoiding people being able to access that type of care.
I think that's also where the contention lies, because I don't think CAS and the findings would suggest that there is good evidence for that. And I think she's suggesting we need to have the evidence before we proceed.
Which is obvious, which brings us back to the quality of the work that's been done.
OK. Well, Robin, I'm thrilled that you've come on to talk about this, and I hope you'll come back again to continue.
Very happy.
Thanks very much for speaking to me.